So that question of when would a society of free and rational individuals choose to organize activity collectively rather than individually? It's a fancy way of saying when would we use government? For what things would a group of rational individuals decide to use government for? So let's zoom out. Let's think big picture. Now, one of the answers, obviously, spillovers are going to be important here because if there's no spillover from your behavior, basically there's nothing we have to worry about. There's no reason to use collective action. But let's see here. Let's start. Turns out that one of the options in the case of a spillover is just to live with the spillover. Maybe we don't do anything. We just live with the spillover. It might well be that the cost of living with the spillover is quite low. We do this all the time. You may not think about it much, but turns out somebody farts in an elevator. We usually just live with the spillover. We kind of hold our nose, we hold our breath, we kind of internally grimace, but we just kind of generally don't say a lot necessarily. The other option here would be what we would call voluntary association and exchange. This part here is what we've really been talking about most of the semester with markets. We use private property rights. We allow people to voluntarily trade back and forth. The association piece is allowing room for non-market transactions, things like charity, things like volunteering. But basically this would be the moral suasion piece that I was talking about before. Basically this would be another way of dealing with the spillover. And most of these we deal with it using voluntary exchange and association. Again, I had to go back to buying my own markers now that I can no longer go to campus. And so I placed an order on Amazon. And I don't know if these were deemed essential items or not, but they did show up not too long ago. There's a huge spillover onto you and onto me of somebody reorganizing their life so that they show up and drop these things off in my mailbox. It's amazing, this positive spillover. How do we address that? Well, turns out the main way we address that in the marker market is to use voluntary exchange. So that's another option. And then finally, we can make a one-size-fits-all decision for the group. Maybe so these are ways of dealing with the spillover. We could just live with it. We could do nothing, just put up with it. We could try and solve it through voluntary exchange and association, or we could use collective action. Basically, somebody or some group makes a decision for everybody, and then that decision is enforced with force. Basically, this is similar to what we have currently. We started out initially kind of saying, oh, maybe this disease, COVID, is not that big a deal. We'll just kind of live with the fact that some of us are going to get sick. Then it became clear that this was a bigger deal than we thought, and so some businesses start curtailing their behavior, and some people close down their shops, and they kind of start changing their behavior, and then eventually we get the governors and even we still haven't gotten the national government, but we get state governors basically saying, you need to stay home or else there's going to be consequences. So when would we want to use each of these? So hopefully you understand what these three options are. Again, we can talk about these more on Wednesday if you have questions about these. And now the question becomes, when would we want to use this? When would we not want to use this? And when would we want to use this? Well, as ever, these are the costs of these things. So when would we want to use A? Well, we would want to use A when A is less than B, which is less than G, or when A is less than G, which is less than B. Either of those situations we would not want to live, we wouldn't want to do anything. So you could think about flatulence in the elevator. We could have the situation, I would suspect that flatulence in the elevator B is less than G. Voluntary exchange and association is less than a collective invasive decision about who gets to eat what and when they get to eat that, and should people ever eat beans, and should people who've eaten beans ever ride in elevators. I think we can understand that B would be less than G. But I would argue that A is almost certainly less than B and G. So we just don't do anything about it, which seems weird to many people, but in cases of extreme spillovers, it's possible to have really big spillovers and still do nothing about them. I'm going to come back to this question. I think I have an example for this one here. Maybe you can start thinking about what would fill this example. So this one here might be the fart in the elevator, or the color of underwear or the style of underwear we wear, right? In other words, yes, there is some spillover, but it's a relatively minor spillover in those cases. Now, let's think about when would we want to use B? Well, it shouldn't be too hard to think about. We'd want to use B when B is less than A, which is less than G, or when B is less than G, less than A. And when would we want to use G? We'd want to use G when G is less than A and B, or it's less than B, which is less than A. So this gives us the answer again. Now, it's not a very satisfying answer. I understand that. I acknowledge that. But this gives us a framework for starting to tell stories. In other words, for a given event, where does it belong? Now, I'm just going to basically clean this up here. And now, here's what I usually hear when we discuss whether we should use government or not. What you'll hear is, yeah, but look, using government, collective action, is a lot lower cost than using markets, right? There's currently this debate right now about whether we should use markets for ventilators, and basically saying, look, the federal government could, at much lower cost, just mandate the acquisition of all these things. We could basically nationalize these industries. We could take them, and basically, some people will say that G is less than B. Does that mean we should use collective action? Well, that piece there, it turns out, would fit with this, and it would fit with this. If it's down here, the answer is, yeah, we should use collective action. If, on the other hand, it's down here, the answer is, no, we shouldn't use collective action. The other thing you'll hear sometimes is a discussion that says, look, B is less than G. Does that mean we should use, and maybe they're right, voluntary exchange and association is less than collective action? I think that's oftentimes the case. The question is, should we use markets here? Well, the answer is, again, now I'm less concerned about this, because if I have a choice, then we're going to, but basically in that situation, this belongs here, and it belongs here. Here we should use markets and voluntary association. Here we should do nothing. Then we could also have, oftentimes people will say, look, maybe G is less than A. They say, look, if we do nothing, the unmitigated spillover are just going to be really, really big. And does that mean we should use collective action? Well, no, because this here, fits with that, and it also fits with this. It turns out, in order to tell a full story here, we need to look at all three of these. That's probably the big takeaway from this, is that we need to look at all three. We need to compare A, B, and G. And so, for example, I'll hear this a fair bit when it comes to higher education. We say, look, if nobody got educated, right? Because there is a big spillover of other people being literate and numerate, right? People being able to read and write means that we can have street signs, right? So maybe we say, look, the spillover is just too large to not do anything about. And it turns out the cost of using G is much lower than the cost of just living with the spillover. Does that mean that we should use government? So we should clearly have government higher education or government educational programs. Of course, my question would be, what about B? If B is less than G, this can be absolutely true, and we should not use G. There's a lot of cases like this. If you start looking at the political discourse through this lens, and I'm not taking any sort of political sides here. You also, by the way, will see discussions about things like, well, B is less than A. Right? Does that mean we should use markets? No, not necessarily. If G is less than B, we would want to use collective action. So it turns out without all three of these, and this tends to be the one that people forget, but without all three of these, we can't tell a quality picture here. And so what we would need to do would be to compare all three. So let me come back to this. And I would argue, so you might say, what's a case where G is less than B, but A is less than G? Now my big case for that would be global warming. So is there going to be is there a spillover from my decision about whether to pollute or not? So I pollute, I emit some carbon dioxide, and then maybe that causes some global warming. I ride my motorcycle around, I pour a lot of concrete. Concrete has a whole lot of carbon emissions. And so you say, okay, you know what? The cost of just living, and we could do this. We could just all live with the spillover, global temperatures. Sorry. That's not usually where people go. What people usually talk about is this. This is the claim, is that G is less than B. You think about the transaction costs involved in getting enough people together to voluntarily cut back on their emissions to an extent that would keep global warming at bay. So those transaction costs are monumental. They're really, really high. We should clearly, in that case, use government. We should get the World Bank and the UN. Basically, we could make a decision about what the level of optimal pollution is, the trade-off between income and pollution. It's sort of like what we're dealing with now, is the trade-off between the economy and health. And you say, well, so maybe we put in place some regulations that are going to cut back on economic growth, but they're going to cut back on global warming as well, and that makes perfect sense. And so that's usually the environmentalist argument. Now, some other people might say, well, look, B is less than G. It turns out that we just, this is some of the people at PERC, where I spend the summer, would make this argument, and in many cases I would buy this argument. They say, look, maybe not for global warming, because global warming has such a large spillover across such a large area, and we'll talk about that in a moment, that we basically can't just leave that up to, to markets necessarily. We might need some of those quasi-markets that I talked about. But for a lot of other things like air pollution or clearly water pollution, markets solve these issues quite well. It's a lot less costly, maybe not less expensive, but it is a lot less costly to use voluntary exchange and association. But neither of those arguments are really all that compelling, because what are we missing? It's entirely possible that we have a situation where A is less than G and B. And I would say that is definitely the case with global warming. That would be my thought. Living with the spillover is almost certainly lower cost than dealing. B is, I think, in the case of global warming, I think B is greater than G. The transaction costs, the enforcement mechanisms, the contracting, it's going to be really hard to get the billions of people on planet Earth to coordinate their behavior on this one margin, without cheating, without free riding off other people. So yeah, collective action is lower cost than B. So we should clearly, well, what would it take? It, in effect, would actually take, for this to work, it would take a global government with a global military. I start thinking about the resources that will go into that and the freedom that's going to get lost and the likelihood that we might actually end up with a totalitarian dictatorship on planet Earth and all of the, and I go, no, I actually think that's a case where living with the fact that global temperatures are going to rise and some parts of the world are going to be less habitable and people are going to have to move, and some parts of the world are going to be more hospitable. I mean, I think in many ways Montana, except for maybe getting really warm in the summer, that's probably one of the places that's going to be the least affected. So we probably would see a benefit from global warming, whereas people in Mauritius or on other islands are going to see a major hardship. But the key is that that hardship, first thing is we want to net out those benefits unless there's an equity or unless there's a rights claim that people on islands have a right not to be affected by this, which I struggle to see. But I think that's a case where the cost might be really, really large. The cost of living with the spillover might be really large, and yet the costs of living with the spillover are still less than using G and B. So what's the upshot of this? The upshot of this is really that this starts to build a way for figuring out what belongs where. Now, this doesn't give us answers, but it gives us a framework for telling stories. So not just is the cost of using government less than the benefit of using government, but we now can start to zoom in on some other costs, because it's not, we now have the cost of doing nothing, just living with an unmitigated spillover, cost of using collective action, and the cost of using voluntary exchange. If you start thinking about this, what percentage of the time do you think actions fall into this category over here? It's an interesting question. Be something for you to maybe write down and maybe email me, right? How about we do that as homework for Friday? Homework for Friday is going to be to say, what percentage of activity do you think falls into this category where G is less than both A and B? What percentage of human activity falls into this category, and why?